just had to show you this beautiful box set here of none other than Stephen King's The Dark Tower. Hey everyone, I'm Nikhil from Shelf-Esteem, a composer for film, television, and gaming, specializing in book adaptations, and this is my ranking of all 8 of Stephen King's The Dark Tower series books. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. For those of you who are new here, my name is Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. This is a booktube channel that talks about books, book adaptations, and some of my experience working as a composer on book adaptations. You might have heard some of my music in The Wheel of Time Season 2, His Dark Materials Season 3, or the official Brent Weeks Lightbringer Companion album. So I'm very excited to talk to you about what is probably in my top 3 fantasy series of all time. This series, for those of you who don't know about The Dark Tower, can barely be called a fantasy series in its own right because it's such a mishmash of many different types of genres. There's Western, there's sci-fi, there is horror, there is historical fiction. It's such a mishmash of all these different genres. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint and call it just an exclusively a fantasy series. Part of the reason I did this video also was, I see a lot of videos about my top Stephen King books. I've even done one. I see a lot of videos about the Dark Tower series as a whole and kind of what it means to people, an analysis of the Dark Tower series. I also see rankings of the Dark Tower books within the context of the Stephen King universe, like tier rankings or fantasy book rankings, that kind of thing. But I don't see too many ranking the Dark Tower series from 8th through 1st place. So that was the impetus of this video. Now, I wanted to talk about the Dark Tower series and just how much it means to me before getting into the rankings. I'm going to keep chapters here so you can skip to whatever you want to skip to in this video. But I want to kind of give some context as to why I chose this particular series, why I wanted to rank this. So back in 2016, when I just started getting back into reading and was looking for more Stephen King books to read, I was also going through a really tough time, in my personal life, in my career. And I was kind of at a pivotal moment where I was making a shift into composing. And at that time, it was December 2016. I would go on long hikes every day. It was raining in LA, which was, always a little bit weird when it rains in LA. Everybody freaks out because that's how rare it is. But it was like raining for a straight month at that time. And so I would try to catch these times when I could go on these hikes when it wasn't raining too badly. And I would come back home after those hikes, morning hikes, and I would just sit and plant myself on the couch and go through systematically each one of these books. And to say it changed my life is kind of an understatement. I mean, it really actually changed the course of my life, the trajectory of my life. I think I understood Roland's obsession for the Dark Tower made so much sense to me from, the fact that there's so many dreams that we all have. And what are we willing to give up in order to pursue that dream? And how healthy is that obsession, really, when you think about it? There's a fine line between, passion and obsession. And so that theme really resonated with me. So for those of you who are new to this series and don't know much about it, this is like the roots to branches in Stephen King's universe. So what that means is this is kind of the tree trunk of his universe. And the branches are books like Salem's Lot, like Insomnia, like It, that are kind of semi-connected to this series. So this is really Stephen King's magnum opus, and to get to know him as an author, the best thing to do is to really read these 8 books. Now, by 8 books, I mean the 7 main books, and then the 8th one, which is called Wind Through the Keyhole, which is a side quest that takes place between books 4 and 5, but came out much later, after the series was over, about 10 years later. I think it came out in 2013. So that's kind of the context of what the series means in the context of the universe of Stephen King. So this particular book series starts with the now famous opening line, which I believe is one of the greatest opening lines in literature history. I mean, it's going to be up there with it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Tale of Two Cities, right? So the first line of the first book of the first chapter is, "The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed." I think that's just a fantastic, it puts you right in the action of Roland's plight as he's chasing this man in black in search of the Dark Tower, that he's not even sure why he's so obsessively searching for this thing. But he feels compelled to keep his journey moving forward, and he makes some friends along the way. And I think that kind of a series where you get to really see these characters develop over 7 books. And it's such a mishmash of many different genres. You'll have fantasy, you'll have sci-fi, you'll have horror, you'll have historical fiction, you'll have pop culture references. It really is all over the map. and yet there's a through line, and the through line is the theme and Roland's journey, and how so much of this series is really all about the journey that they take, that the characters take throughout these novels. So if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. It really changed my life. I think that you may benefit from reading the majesty of Stephen King's Dark Tower series and getting to explore his universe as a whole. So without further ado, let's jump into some rankings, shall we? So number 8 will probably be no surprise to most of you. It will be Wind Through the Keyhole. I'm going to put little pictures of the individual books up here. That way I don't have to take it out of this, and you can just kind of admire this beautiful box set here with me. But number 8 is Wind Through the Keyhole. Now, this should come as no surprise to most of you, as it was more of a side quest novel. It's really well done. It's just a fantastic read. It's a lot shorter than most of the Dark Tower books. You know, it's only a couple hundred pages, whereas most of the Dark Tower books, with the exception of the first, get to be, 600, 700 pages. So it's definitely one of the shorter ones. It's very well paced. It's very well plotted. The only thing I would say about that particular one is it doesn't really add much to the main story. One could argue that it adds a lot through to the dynamics of Roland and Susanna and Eddie and Jake. But beyond that, it doesn't really necessarily tell you more that will add to the richness of this lore that's already been explored in the 7 books. So, fantastic read. I would highly recommend you check it out anyways, for Dark Tower completionists, but then just as a standalone, it's a fun ride, But I wouldn't say that it's completely, life-changing in any particular way. So, that was number 8, Wind Through the Keyhole. Number 7, some people's least favorite Dark Tower book and some people's most favorite Dark Tower book. Now, this one's very polarizing, and it might come as no surprise to some of you that it is book number 1, The Gunslinger. So, aside from that beautiful opening line I said to you a little earlier, the book is a little interesting. It's about 280 pages long. It was started in the early 70s by Stephen King. It was kind of a story that was serially published in magazines before it was compiled into its edition in 1982, I want to say. And so you see Stephen King as a much younger writer who's still kind of trying to figure himself out. The book tonally feels very different. It feels a lot more dry. You feel like you're kind of thrust into this world without really any kind of context of where you are or why you are there. And you really don't identify with Roland in the same way because he seems almost machine-like in his quest for the Dark Tower in this book. You get a little bit of a glimpse of one of the main characters in this book, but you don't really get to see much more than that. It is a fantastic read. Now, I've read it twice now. I'm doing a reread of The Dark Tower, so I read through the first 6 completely twice now. So the first one, on the second read, I will say it's far better, because once you know how the series ends, and then you go back to the first, you can see how all the seeds were planted for the ending in that first book. So highly recommend it if you've already read it and you felt a little mixed about it and you get some time to get away from the book series and you want to come back and revisit, definitely check out that first book. I think it's fantastic. It's very much a Western at its heart, It's very influenced by Sergio Leone movies and Magnificent Seven, that kind of a feel. So it's tonally quite different to some of the other books. But number 7 is The Gunslinger, which is the first book in the Dark Tower series for me. Number 6 is also the 6th book in the Dark Tower series, and it is called The Song of Susanna. Now, also one of the shorter ones, so I think you can detect a trend here. I'm liking the longer ones much more, but, Stephen King has a really good way of developing his characters in a lot of the longer ones. In the shorter ones, I felt like you're kind of rushing a little bit, and The Song of Susanna is no exception. I think the ideas that were presented in here, I know they are very polarizing. Some people love it, some people hate it. I personally love the ideas that were presented in this book. But I don't necessarily feel like he gave those ideas enough time to develop. So when they arrived, it felt like it was kind of coming from nowhere, if that makes sense. Now, a little contextual reference. In 1999, I want to say, I could be wrong on this year, so please correct me. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. But I think it was in the late 90s, might have been 1999. Stephen King had an accident and he wasn't expected to live. He was hit by a car. And in his long road to recovery, he realized one of his greatest fears was leaving the Dark Tower unfinished. He had, up to that point, done 4 books. So he wrote the 5th, 6th, and 7th books all in a rush, and he released them, within a year apart. So a lot of people feel like, the 5th, 6th, and 7th are not quite like the first 4, and they don't really reflect, like, the genius level that he achieved in those first 4 books. Now, I'm on this reread, so I'm seeing it from a different lens. And I think the first time I read Song of Susanna, I felt like it was weird because it was both rushed and also dragging at times. Now, the second time I'm reading it, I can appreciate it a lot more, and I feel like the out there ideas he had were actually pretty fantastic in their own right. I think if he had had a little bit more time for those ideas to develop, could have served the book a little bit better. But that's kind of my thoughts for this book. So number 6, Song of Susanna. So number 5 is the last book in the series, The Dark Tower. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about this one. It's very interesting because for me, it was a very uneven book. The last maybe third of the book is absolutely brilliant. Now, there's a few choices that are made in that last third of the book that people contest. There's a particular showdown that people felt was very lackluster, for lack of a better word. Very anticlimactic. Now, if you've read through the series or you reread the series, you realize why it had to be anticlimactic. It was an actual, by design, an important part of that. I don't want to give that away in spoilers. We can talk about that, please feel free to message me or something like that, and we can chat about it that way. I'm just trying to be very careful of spoilers and things like that. But there's a reason why those decisions were made, and you can appreciate it once you've read the ending. I think the ending is one of the greatest endings I've ever read in a fantasy series, and it shocked me to the core. I mean, talk about shocker. I couldn't read anything for 3 weeks after that. So on the one hand, it was absolutely brilliant to me. On the other hand, it's one of the longest Dark Tower books, and it does drag a little bit. There are parts where it feels like, is this the 7th book? This is the last one? It doesn't feel like it's pile driving to a finish line, There's no huge avalanche of stuff happening all at once. So I think it could have benefited from better pacing. But I think the character payoffs in this one are just fantastic. I love where all the characters end up. So I would say the 5th best Dark Tower book, for me, right in the middle, would be The Dark Tower, the self-titled finale. Now, number 4, for me, was the first book that Stephen King wrote after his accident in the Dark Tower series, and that is Wolves of the Kala. Now, this is the first book out of the Dark Tower series I felt like, you had such a great run of books 2, 3, and 4. And the 5th one was the first one where you started to see a little pacing problems, a couple of anticlimactic moments that I think could have been built up a little bit more. There were parts that dragged on a long time, and then there were specific parts that it was building to that you felt like it suddenly felt very rushed. So I think the uneven nature of it kept it from being one of the all-time great Dark Tower books. Having said that, it's an essential read, gives you way more characterization into Roland, gives you way more characterization into Susanna, and really sets up the 6th book nicely. It has an identity of its own, and it's definitely worth your read. Number 4 is Wolves of the Kala. So now we're down to the top 3, and these ones are tough to really rank because they are all so good, so mind-bending. This is the high point of the series to me and to a lot of Dark Tower fans. So, I'm sure you'll have different opinions on these, and you might have different opinions on all the other ones too. So without further ado, number 3 for me was the 2nd book in the Dark Tower series, The Drawing of the Three. Now, this could have been easily a number 1 in any other series. It's just that the bar is so high at this point. Drawing of the Three is such a hard left turn from book 1. You know how I mentioned to you book 1 was tonally a little bit different than the rest of the series, and you kind of feel like it's a little drier, it's a little bit more flat characterizations. Deliberately so, you'll see why as the series progresses, is where it really starts to take a hard left turn and open up Stephen King's larger universe in addition to the world of the Dark Tower. You start to meet other characters along the way that are first introduced, like Eddie, like Susanna. So it's a very interesting book. It's a very psychedelic, I would say, to kind of become a portal to this multiverse that Stephen King has done. So it's just a fantastic read. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. When I first read The Gunslinger, I was honestly not sure what to think about the rest of the series. I didn't even know if I wanted to continue, but I decided to try the 2nd book just to give it a shot. And within the first chapter, I knew this is a series unlike anything I've ever read before. And I just had to keep reading it. And that was it. I didn't look back after that. Gives you an idea of how profoundly different the 2nd book is from the first. So my number 3 pick is The Drawing of the Three. Number 2 and number 1, I honestly could interchange on my list. I would have to give the number 2 slot to a book that gives 2/3 of its contents to a flashback. Wizard and Glass is in my number 2 slot. Now, when you think about in the middle of a series, a book having a 500-page flashback, You would think that's just absolutely insane. Why would anyone want to read that? And I felt similarly as I entered that flashback. I was like, how long is this thing going to go on? It's absurd. And yet it's done with such beauty and depth and heartbreaking sadness that, like, you really feel for Roland's plight. You get to understand Roland as a character, as a person, and you kind of get to see the decisions he's making as a result of how he was shaped when he was younger. So you get an insight into Roland's backstory and his kind of companions at that time in a way that you don't really, you kind of start to hear about them, little bits and pieces here and there in books 2 and 3 in particular, but you really get to see him recount his life and kind of talk about what led him on this quest for the Dark Tower. And I gotta say, it was my favorite part, one of my favorite parts of the entire series, to the point where once that 500-page flashback ended, I didn't want to go back. I wanted to stay in that world, the world of Roland's past. And some of the haunting natures of the decisions he made and the consequences of those decisions end up permeating through this entire series. So Wizard in Glass is book 4 and takes the number 2 slot, which can only mean one thing. The number 1 slot goes to The Wastelands, book number 3 of the Dark Tower series. The Wastelands, number 3, my number 1 pick, is quintessential King at his weirdest whilst maintaining tight characters, plotting, and pacing. You see the 4 main characters, the quartet, he calls them, appear all together in frame for the first time. It is trippy, it is grotesque, there's some horror elements, iconic characters like TikTok Man, Gasher, Blaine the Train, Charlie and the Choo Choo, even some references to like 1970s pop culture. So just a true masterpiece in the world of fiction, in the world of literature, and also in the world of fantasy. This is like the quintessential mashup book in the sense of, like, remember I was talking about earlier in the video, it blends fantasy, sci-fi, horror, all these different genres. This book does it in spades, and in my opinion, it's the perfect Dark Tower book. So that concludes my rankings for the 8 Dark Tower books in the series. Tell me a little bit in the comments, what would your rankings be? Have you ever read these books? How does your rankings differ to mine? I would love to know. Let's make this a dialogue. I love talking about books, even if we disagree. Leave it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. Be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and I'll see you next time. Take care.